The snow had not yet melted in Prague. It was early spring, but winter clung to the air like the memory of blood on stone. The bells of St. Vitus Cathedral tolled across the Vltava River, echoing off the red rooftops and narrow cobbled streets of a kingdom without a ruler. Soldiers stood frozen in the courtyards. Nobles whispered behind velvet drapes, and somewhere in the castle, a young girl watched the shadows stretch long across the marble floor. Her name was Elisabeth of Bohemia, and she was only 10 years old. She had just lost her father, King Wenceslas II, whose sudden death in 1305 had thrown Bohemia into chaos. Her older brother, Wenceslas III, the last male heir of the mighty Přemyslid dynasty, ascended the throne. But within a year, he was dead too, stabbed to death under mysterious circumstances in Olomouc. No suspect was ever tried. No one ever confessed. Bohemia had no king, no male heir, no protector. The royal family fractured. The crown, heavy with the weight of ancient authority, sat unworn on a velvet pillow while the throne itself stood like an accusation in an empty hall. And somewhere in the dark corners of court, Elizabeth was already listening. Her cousins fought over titles. German princes circled like wolves, sniffing weakness. The Holy Roman Empire whispered of annexation. France considered Bohemia ripe for marriage and political leverage. And through it all, the people of Prague waited for something or someone to rise from the ashes of their monarchy. Elizabeth was too young to wield a sword, but she understood the weapons of court. Silence, observation, timing. She watched as her cousin, Henry of Carinthia, married her sister and then took the throne. Henry was weak, unpopular, a foreigner. Elizabeth saw the nobles scoff behind his back. The Bohemian lords, proud of their Czech identity, refused to bow their heads to a man they did not respect. Henry's reign was not a rule. It was a placeholder. For 4 years, Bohemia teetered. The great Přemyslid legacy, the royal line that had ruled for nearly 400 years, seemed doomed to vanish into history. The last flicker of its bloodline remained in the veins of Elizabeth, barely a teenager and almost entirely forgotten by the power brokers of the realm. But not for long. In 1309, the court began whispering about a new proposal. The Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VII of Luxembourg, had a plan. His son, John, barely 14 years old, would marry Elizabeth, thus granting Luxembourg a foothold in Bohemia and sealing the fading Czech throne under imperial oversight. It was a brilliant plan, a calculated one, but it was also built on a lie that Elizabeth would bend. She didn't. When the imperial envoys arrived in Prague, Elizabeth refused to cooperate. She did not trust them. She did not want a husband chosen by Rome or Luxembourg. She did not want to be a pawn. And most of all, she did not want to become the quiet, obedient wife of a foreign child she had never met. The pressure was immense. The Dowager Queen, Elisabeth Rejga, allied with the church and several powerful bishops, tried to force her into marriage with another German noble. At one point, they even discussed removing her entirely, cloistering her in a convent. Out of the political spotlight, silencing the Přemyslid claim once and for all. But Elizabeth had other plans. With her teenage resolve hardened into steel, she fled the palace with a small band of loyal nobles and took refuge with Henry of Lipa, one of the most influential Czech lords. It was an act of open defiance, and it shocked the court. A princess had not only rejected the church's authority but aligned herself with the nationalist cause. It was the first sign of who Elizabeth really was, not a girl to be married off, but a woman who would shape kingdoms. In exile, she built alliances. She promised noble titles. She spoke to merchants, landowners, bishops. She reminded them of their Czech identity, their blood, their culture, their need for a monarch who understood them. Her words were not filled with fury but with clarity. She never yelled. She never wept. She simply explained the future she envisioned. And others, stunned by her composure, listened. When Henry VII of Luxembourg heard of this girl, this teenage spark of resistance, he realized he needed her more than she needed him. She wasn't a liability. She was the key. Marrying her to his son John would not just grant them legal claim to Bohemia. It would give them legitimacy in the hearts of its people. And so the deal was struck, not behind Elizabeth's back, but with her input. In 1310, Elisabeth of Bohemia returned to Prague not as a refugee but as a queen-to-be. She rode through the city gates beside Luxembourgian banners, flanked by armed riders. The people cheered not for John, whom they barely knew, but for her. She was the daughter of Wenceslaus, the last light of the Przemyslid line. The wedding was held with immense ceremony. Bells rang from every church tower. Nobles dined in candlelit halls. Priests offered blessings in 3 languages. Elisabeth wore a gown of blood-red silk embroidered with the lion crest of Bohemia. John, still just a boy of 14, stood beside her, awkward, quiet, already aware that he had married someone far stronger than he had imagined. But the marriage was not the victory. The victory came after, when they took Prague by sword. The city, still loyal to the old guard, resisted John's claims. Elisabeth ordered their troops forward. Luxembourg's forces, led by seasoned generals, stormed the castle. Her cousin Henry of Carinthia, the weak puppet king, fled in disgrace. There was no dramatic duel, no cinematic moment of confrontation, only the cold, efficient transition of power. By year's end, Elisabeth was Queen of Bohemia. John was king in title. But the people, the nobles, and the soul of the country still looked to her. She was just 18 years old. Yet even in victory, cracks began to form. John, raised in the courts of Luxembourg and Paris, found Czech culture crude and provincial. He disliked the language, mistrusted the local nobles, and often clashed with Elisabeth over governance. He brought German advisors into the palace. He enacted reforms that alienated the people. He spoke of empires, not nations. Elisabeth, by contrast, clung to her roots. She surrounded herself with Czech thinkers, poets, and nationalists. She spoke the language fluently and insisted their children be raised in the traditions of Bohemia. In her eyes, John was not just forgetting where he ruled. He was becoming a stranger to the very people whose loyalty they had fought for. And so the marriage, once a promise of unity, became a duel of wills. Behind the curtains of Prague Castle, silence replaced conversation. At court banquets, they sat coldly beside one another. When Elisabeth gave birth to a son, the boy who would one day become Charles IV, she insisted on naming him Václav after her father. John protested. She won. But politics does not wait for reconciliation. Factions formed. Nobles chose sides. And eventually war broke out not between nations but between husband and wife. In the years to come, Elisabeth would be forced into exile. She would watch as her husband claimed full custody of their children. She would die young, at just 38, broken in body but not in vision. John would become a wandering warrior king, famous across Europe but almost invisible in the land he once ruled. And yet, long after both were gone, their son, Charles, would remember. He would remember his mother's stories, her stubbornness, her fierce protection of a culture that no one else seemed to value. When he took the imperial crown, he did so not only as a Luxembourg heir, but as Elisabeth's son. He rebuilt Prague. He codified Czech law. He built the first university in Central Europe. And in the marble of its foundation, he carved a single symbol, the Lion of Bohemia. That lion, Elisabeth's lion, still flies on the Czech flag today. It all began in a kingdom without a king, and a girl who refused to be quiet. History is full of kings who ruled by divine right, born into thrones, anointed by church and sword. But every now and then history pauses for someone who wasn't supposed to rule at all. Someone like Elisabeth of Bohemia, who began her fight for power not with an army but with a refusal. The year was 1308. Elisabeth was 16 years old. Her hair was black as raven feathers, braided down her back with pearls from the Danube. Her eyes were sharp but not cruel, the kind that noticed everything and forgot nothing. And in the grand court of Prague, she stood completely alone. Her sister Anne, now queen by marriage to Henry of Carinthia, ruled beside a man the people despised. Henry was spineless, a political placeholder tolerated by the nobles, ignored by the church and mocked by the people. Yet behind the throne, real power stirred. The Dowager Queen Elisabeth Rejka had taken control of the Bohemian court, and she had plans for young Elisabeth. Plans that didn't involve a crown. The Dowager wanted her married to a German prince, preferably one loyal to her inner circle. Not for love, not for stability, but to bury the Przemyslid line quietly, one daughter at a time. With Elisabeth married off and controlled, the dynasty would end. The throne could pass fully into German hands. But Elisabeth, sharp-tongued, politically aware, and painfully conscious of her bloodline, refused. She rejected the dowager's suitor outright, refused to attend court functions, refused to speak when spoken to. And when the priests tried to intervene, citing duty and obedience, she simply stared at them in silence. In her world, silence was not submission, it was resistance. That silence rattled the court. At first, the nobles dismissed her as a dramatic teenager. But then came the letters, secret communications between Elisabeth and several powerful Czech lords, particularly Henry of Lippe, a veteran nobleman with immense military and economic power. What the court didn't understand, what the dowager had misjudged, was that Elisabeth wasn't acting out. She was organizing. She had read the room. She saw how the Bohemian lords resented Henry of Carinthia, how they despised the rising German influence. And she knew one crucial truth. Bohemia was leaderless and the people were desperate for someone to believe in. And so she became that someone. She began appearing at noble estates outside Prague. Dressed in traditional Bohemian gowns, speaking Czech with pride. She quoted the great kings of old, Otakar II, Wenceslas I, invoking not just nostalgia but nationalism. Her words weren't fiery. They were precise, logical. She didn't rage against the German influence. She simply reminded the people what Bohemia had been and what it could be again. And quietly, the lords began to listen. Back in court, panic set in. The dowager, infuriated that her ward was turning into a political figure, tried to have her confined to a monastery. A gilded prison with velvet beds and locked doors. A holy excuse to remove her from the chessboard. But Elisabeth had already made her move. On a cold night in early spring, under the cover of a thick Bohemian fog, she escaped the castle with only a few handmaids and 2 trusted guards. She rode hard through the dark forests, across frozen creeks and narrow valleys, until she reached the estate of Henry of Lippe. There, in a stone hall surrounded by weathered generals and noblemen in fur cloaks, she pledged herself to the defense of Bohemia, not as a queen, not yet, but as a daughter of the land. She did not offer them riches or titles. She offered them conviction. She said, "You want a king? Find one who loves Bohemia. You want peace? Choose someone who speaks your name with honor. But if you want me gone, if you want me quiet, then I say this, bury me with my father and call it a day. Because I will not be sent away. I will not be forgotten. I am the blood of kings. And I will not obey." Those words would be remembered for generations. They made their way back to Prague in whispered echoes. Nobles repeated them in court. Peasants quoted them in markets. And when the Holy Roman Emperor heard of this girl, this defiant, politically dangerous teenage girl, he didn't see a problem. He saw a solution. Emperor Henry VII of Luxembourg, newly crowned and looking to expand his influence, had a son, John. Young, educated, charming, and more importantly, unentangled in Bohemian politics. If he could marry Elisabeth, he could secure Bohemia for the empire. But he couldn't approach her as a suitor. He had to come as a partner. Letters were exchanged, then envoys, then promises. Henry of Lippe brokered the deal, ensuring Elisabeth would not be sold but elevated. She would retain her claim to the throne. The marriage would be an alliance, not a transaction. And so, in late 1310, Elisabeth returned to Prague. Not in chains, not in shame, but flanked by imperial banners and Bohemian riders. It was a strange sight. A girl not yet 18, leading an army of nobles through the city that once tried to silence her. The marriage was celebrated with grand fanfare. The people, desperate for hope, cheered in the streets. John of Luxembourg, elegant in foreign silks, young and golden-haired, stood beside his fierce Czech bride. Together, they were crowned king and queen of Bohemia. But beneath the flowers and trumpet blasts, something darker stirred. Because Elisabeth had not obeyed. And people do not forget a woman who refuses to kneel. The dowager never forgave her. The court, divided and bitter, remained suspicious. Even John, though grateful for her political strength, began to feel its weight. He had married a queen, yes, but also a rival. A woman with her own vision, her own allies, her own claim. It would not be a peaceful marriage, and it would not be a peaceful reign. But for that moment, as bells rang over Prague and the people shouted her name, Elisabeth stood victorious, not as a pawn, but as a queen who had carved her place into the world by sheer will. She had not obeyed. And because of that, Bohemia had a future. The ceremony was over. The last bells had stopped ringing. The candles had burned low and the roses strewn across the floor of Prague Castle had begun to wither. Elisabeth of Bohemia stood at the center of the throne room, her crown freshly placed, her gown still heavy with the scent of frankincense and steel. And beside her, a boy who would soon become a legend but who, in that moment, was simply afraid. John of Luxembourg, son of Emperor Henry VII, was only 14. He had grown up in the courts of the West, born in Luxembourg, raised between Paris and the imperial palaces of the Rhine, educated by clerics and knights, trained in Latin, law, and the sword. He spoke French, Latin, German, but not Czech. He read the works of Roman emperors, but not the poetry of Bohemia. He had never walked the stone streets of Prague until his wedding day. He was not ready to be a king, and he certainly wasn't ready to be the husband of a woman like Elisabeth. To him, she was radiant, noble, and terrifying. Where John had been taught diplomacy, Elisabeth wielded defiance. Where he had learned the rules of courtly behavior, she had rewritten them. And though she was only a few years older, she carried herself like someone who had survived a war. Because in many ways she had. Their wedding night was not recorded. No letters survive. But court rumors spread quickly. Some said Elisabeth refused to speak to him. Others claimed she mocked his foreign advisors in front of his face. One thing was certain. They were not partners. Not yet. John had entered Bohemia with banners and blessings, but he was still an outsider. The Czech nobles eyed him with skepticism. The church expected obedience. The people, stirred by Elisabeth's defiance, wanted a king who could feel like theirs. He tried. In the early months of his reign, John rode across Bohemia, visiting towns, attending mass, giving coin to peasants, watching duels. He dressed in Czech furs. He listened to songs he could not understand. He nodded politely while nobles quoted kings whose names he barely recognized. And all the while Elisabeth watched. She said little. She attended court events in silence. But when she did speak, in private to her supporters, she spoke plainly. He is not one of us. John noticed, and in response he began replacing Czech advisors with German ones. He restructured the royal council. He corresponded more frequently with his father and German allies than with the nobles in his own land. He spent more time in imperial cities than in Prague. He brought in foreign judges, foreign architects, foreign tutors. His vision of Bohemia was imperial, an extension of the Luxembourg dynasty. But Elisabeth's vision was Bohemian, fiercely local, defiantly national. And so, the cracks began to spread. By 1311, just 1 year after their wedding, it was clear to anyone in court that the king and queen were at odds. Their public appearances were brief. Their conversations were curt. Their allies spoke over one another in council, their priorities clashing like swords. John saw Elisabeth not as a partner, but as a challenge to his authority. She held sway over the Czech nobility in ways he could not. Her bloodline gave her a legitimacy he could never possess. And worst of all, she had never needed him. He had been brought in to rule a kingdom she had already claimed in spirit. And yet, despite everything, the world still turned. Crops grew. Armies drilled. The borders of Bohemia held firm. And on a cold winter morning, Elisabeth gave birth to their first son. They named him Wenceslas after her father, a decision made entirely by Elisabeth without consulting John. It was a clear message. The boy who would later become Emperor Charles IV was baptized in Czech rites, surrounded by Elisabeth's allies. The nobles cheered, the churches rang bells. The people rejoiced. John sat in the corner, silent. He would eventually rename the boy Charles after Charlemagne, the first of many decisions that would tug his son between two worlds. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Europe trembled. The Holy Roman Empire was shifting. France and England teetered toward war. Hungary eyed Bohemia with suspicion. And inside the empire, nobles began questioning Henry VII's authority. When John's father died in 1313, the throne of the empire was left uncertain. John, still just a teenager, found himself at the center of a continent spiraling into political chaos. And back in Prague, Elisabeth took advantage of the moment. With her husband away negotiating imperial claims, Elisabeth reasserted herself in Bohemian court politics. She restored titles to her allies. She hosted councils in Czech, sidelining German-speaking advisors. She rode through the countryside with her son, meeting local leaders, solidifying her image not as a royal wife, but as the true mother of the nation. When John returned, he was furious. And from that fury came a decision that would haunt both of them for years. John exiled Henry of Lippe, Elizabeth's closest ally, on charges of treason. The man who had protected her, supported her claim, sheltered her during exile, gone. It was a move meant to break her network, to show the court who held true power. But instead it broke something deeper. Elizabeth, for all her strength, could not protect her own. And that hurt worse than any insult, worse than any exile. She withdrew from court. She stopped attending meetings. She stopped speaking to John entirely. What had begun as political friction became personal collapse. The marriage now existed only on paper, two monarchs sharing a throne, a bed, a child, but no loyalty, no love, no respect. And in the silence that followed, Bohemia once again slipped toward instability. Because when the king and queen are at war, the kingdom is never far behind. They were king and queen, crowned with gold, seated on thrones carved from ancient stone, draped in banners that fluttered with the pride of a kingdom reborn. But there was no peace in Prague Castle. Not in the marble halls. Not in the bedchambers. Not even in the throne room. Because Elisabeth of Bohemia and John of Luxembourg ruled the same land, but lived in different worlds. Their marriage had started in politics and stayed there, a transaction masked in ceremony. From the outside, it looked regal, united. A young king and queen presiding over one of Europe's most storied kingdoms. But beneath the silver goblets and courtly smiles, the truth was rotting. They had nothing in common but power. John was still barely out of boyhood, but already full of ambition. He had inherited not just a crown but a legacy. His father, Emperor Henry VII, had dreamed of uniting Central Europe under Luxembourg rule. Now John saw Bohemia not as a home but as a tool, a stepping stone to bigger thrones. His eyes turned westward to the Holy Roman Empire, to France, to Italy. He dreamed of campaigns, alliances, royal councils in Strasbourg and Avignon. He wanted to be a universal ruler, fluent in diplomacy, war, and imperial etiquette. Bohemia was too provincial, too stubborn, too Czech. And Elizabeth? She was Bohemia. She had grown up in these halls, walked the forests of Moravia, whispered prayers in the old tongue. Her bloodline, the Přemyslids, had ruled for centuries before John ever set foot in Prague. To her, the land wasn't an opportunity. It was inheritance, identity, duty. She dreamed not of Rome or Paris, but of rebuilding the Bohemian state, strengthening its laws, empowering its nobles, restoring Czech culture to prominence. Every decision she made as queen, from the language of court decrees to the musicians she hired for festivals, was a declaration of sovereignty. And so, two visions collided under the same roof. At first, the conflict was cold. Awkward silences in meetings, competing patronage, subtle corrections at court banquets. But over time, it hardened. When Elizabeth insisted their son be educated in Czech tradition, John countered by hiring French tutors. When she advocated for land grants to local nobles, he funneled property to German allies. The court began to split along these lines. On one side, Elizabeth's Bohemian faction, proud, nationalistic, wary of foreign influence. On the other, John's Luxembourgian faction, urbane, ambitious, loyal to the imperial structure. And in between them, the people of Prague watched, waiting to see who would blink first. But Elizabeth didn't blink. She never had. In public, she wore the crown with grace, but behind the scenes she grew sharper. Strategic. Her letters to allies took on new urgency. She built relationships with the Catholic Church, the artisan guilds, and rural nobles who had never before been courted by royalty. She was building a shadow court, not in secret but in parallel. John noticed. He responded by tightening his grip. He began issuing royal decrees without her approval. He placed German magistrates in key cities. He strengthened ties with the emperor's allies in the west. And most devastatingly, he cut Elizabeth off from her children. One by one, their sons, Wenceslaus, John Henry, Charles, were taken under John's authority. He moved them to foreign courts, placed them under foreign tutors. He wanted them to grow up loyal to him, to the empire, not to their Czech mother. It wasn't just politics. It was punishment. Elisabeth was devastated. But she did not fold. Instead, she began speaking publicly not just to nobles but to the people. In marketplaces, in churches, at harvest festivals. She invoked the ancient kings, reminded them of their heritage. She questioned the presence of foreign soldiers in Czech towns. She cast doubt on her own husband's loyalty to the land he claimed to rule. And people listened. Bohemia had always been a proud kingdom, fiercely independent, culturally rich. The people remembered the legends of King Premisl the plowman, the stories of their saints, their victories, their losses. Elisabeth's words stirred those memories. And suddenly John's foreign court didn't feel modern, it felt invasive. John retaliated. He imprisoned Henry of Lippe once again. He exiled Czech clergy. He raised taxes. He increased military patrols in regions known to support Elisabeth. But power built on fear only lasts so long. By 1321, Elisabeth had enough. In a stunning act of rebellion, she left Prague with her youngest children, escorted by a small retinue of loyal nobles. It wasn't exile, not yet. It was a strategic withdrawal, a refusal to participate in a court she no longer controlled. She set up residence in Český Krumlov, a quiet Bohemian town nestled in the hills. There, she began preparing for something unthinkable. Civil war. She contacted noble families across Bohemia and Moravia. She wrote to sympathetic bishops. She quietly amassed funds. And most importantly, she began working to secure a marriage alliance between her son Charles and a powerful noble family that opposed John. Her goal was clear: rescue her son, restore Bohemian sovereignty, and end John's reign or die trying. Back in Prague, John was livid. But he could not afford open war, not yet. His attentions were pulled elsewhere, in Italy and the Empire. And so, for a time, an uneasy Cold War settled over the kingdom. Two monarchs, two courts, two visions of Bohemia, but only one would survive. And as Elisabeth sharpened her resolve in exile, John prepared for his final move, one that would change everything. Because the next time they met, it would not be as husband and wife. It would be as rivals. She once walked through Prague as its lion-hearted queen, banners high, nobles at her side, the weight of her ancestors in every step. But now Elisabeth of Bohemia moved like a ghost. No longer welcome in the court she had once ruled, she lived in exile, not in chains, but in silence. Her world had shrunk. From a kingdom to a countryside manor. From royal courts to candlelit rooms where whispers carried more power than proclamations. She had not been officially deposed. No decree had stripped her of her crown. But her husband, John of Luxembourg, had done something more devastating. He made her irrelevant. And for a woman like Elisabeth, that was a slow death. John had reclaimed Prague, reasserted control over the court, and taken custody of their children. He replaced Czech nobles with German advisors, moved the royal treasury into his hands, and began traveling more frequently to the west, to Italy, to the Empire, to France, building his image as a pan-European monarch. In Bohemia, he became a distant king, more myth than man. He ruled from afar, rarely speaking the language of the people, and yet his grip was tight. And Elisabeth? She was watched. Every letter she sent was intercepted. Every visitor to her estate questioned. She was kept out of political decisions. Her name was removed from court rituals. Her banners no longer flew above public halls. But what they didn't understand, what John never understood, was that power does not disappear when the crown is taken. Sometimes it only grows more dangerous in the dark. And in the shadows. Elisabeth began to play the long game. She had nothing left to win for herself, no throne, no authority. But she had something far more precious, her son, Charles. The boy had been renamed by his father, reshaped by foreign tutors, sent to imperial cities to be molded into a Luxembourg prince. But Elisabeth had raised him first. And she had whispered into his ears stories he would never forget. Stories of Bohemian kings, of honor, of loyalty to the land, of the old saints and forgotten heroes. She had told him who he was before the empire could tell him who to become. Even in exile, she sent him coded letters, messages sewn into embroidery, smuggled in prayer books, carried by merchant families loyal to the old dynasty. In those letters, she reminded him of who he truly was. Never forget, my son. You are the child of kings, not emperors. Of earth, not thrones. Of the plow, not the sword. Meanwhile, the court mocked her. To John's allies, Elisabeth had become a relic, an irrelevant woman whose time had passed. A tragic figure living on the edge of the kingdom, forgotten by the pages of policy, too proud to surrender, too powerless to fight. But in the countryside, the people remembered. To the farmers, to the old noble families, to the parish priests, she was still Elisabeth Premislavna, the last true-born heir to the ancient bloodline of Bohemia, the queen who had once stood against Rome, the church, and even her own husband, a symbol of national pride and sorrow. Poems were written about her, ballads sung at weddings, children named after her. She was no longer a queen of action, but she had become something more enduring, a legend in her own lifetime. And yet, behind that myth was a mother, grieving, lonely Illinois. Years of stress, separation, and cold stone halls had begun to take their toll. She coughed often. She no longer rode horses through the forests she loved. Her hair thinned, her voice quieted, and the letters to Charles became less frequent. Not because she had nothing to say, but because it hurt to say it. She knew she would never return to power. She knew she would likely never see her son again. But she had done something even the most powerful kings failed to do. She had planted an idea. And in Charles, that idea would one day bloom into an empire. In the final winters of her life, Elisabeth stopped speaking of politics. She spoke of memory. She recounted the legends of Bohemia, asked her ladies-in-waiting to read aloud old manuscripts, requested songs sung only in Czech. Her nights were filled with candlelight, old prayers, and the sound of wind through the cracks of ancient windows. And when she died in 1330, at the age of just 38, there was no grand funeral, no trumpets, no state procession. Her body was buried quietly in the monastery of Zbraslav beside her ancestors. No monument was raised in her name, no feast declared in her honor. But in the minds of the people, she never left. And in the mind of her son, Charles, now a young man studying abroad, she burned like fire. Years later, when he became king, then emperor, he would invoke her in speeches. He would preserve Czech laws, elevate Prague to a capital of learning, build a university, and defend the tongue his mother had taught him to cherish. He would rule as a man of two crowns, imperial and Bohemian, but his soul would always belong to the queen in shadows. And so Elisabeth of Bohemia faded from the halls of power. But not from the story. She had lost the throne. She had lost the court. But she had never lost the future. History often imagines civil war as cannons and banners, battlefields and blood. But some civil wars begin in silence, behind closed doors, whispered in monasteries, carried in letters smuggled beneath cloaks. Wars not for land, but for legacy. And in the early 1320s, Bohemia began to fracture, not between north and south, but between king and queen, between father and mother, between John of Luxembourg and Elisabeth of Bohemia. Their marriage had long since collapsed. She exiled in sorrow and sickness. He abroad in Rome and France, playing imperial diplomat, carving his name into the chessboard of Europe. But in Bohemia, the pieces were still moving, and the people still choosing sides. Elisabeth had not raised an army. She had no troops, no court, no treasury. But she had something far more dangerous, a story. One that resonated in taverns, churches, and noble halls alike. The story of a queen abandoned by a foreign king. A daughter of Bohemia cast aside by outsiders. A mother whose children had been taken, but whose spirit could not be broken. And in a land still fiercely proud of its Czech identity, that story was enough to ignite fire. By 1322, noble houses across Bohemia had begun to publicly question John's right to rule. They resented the German advisors flooding the court, the imperial taxes, the way Prague had become a satellite of Luxembourg rather than a capital of its own people. And behind those doubts, quietly, stood Elisabeth. She did not declare rebellion. She didn't have to. Her letters circulated through noble families. Her crest appeared subtly on seals of resistance. Young men in the countryside began referring to themselves not as royalists, but sons of the lioness. And finally, the spark came. In the summer of 1323, John issued a series of harsh reforms aimed at centralizing authority, stripping land from regional lords, enforcing German as the official language of court, and increasing taxes to fund military campaigns in Italy. To many Bohemians, it was the final insult. Led by the House of Wittkowski and several key Moravian lords, a confederation of Czech nobles rose up, demanding the restoration of Czech autonomy and the recognition of Elisabeth as regent. They sent a message to Prague. We do not rise against the king. We rise for Bohemia, and Bohemia belongs to her daughter. John was stunned. He had underestimated her again. He had believed Elisabeth was broken, a woman of tears and prayers, dying in exile. But she had become something else entirely. A cause. With imperial dignity wounded, John responded the only way he knew how, with force. He summoned troops from the Rhineland, hired German mercenaries, secured funding from imperial allies, and marched back to Bohemia not as a husband reclaiming a home, but as a ruler putting down a rebellion. The kingdom braced for war. Skirmishes broke out in southern towns. Fortresses were seized, then retaken. Entire villages burned. And through it all, the names shouted by peasants and knights alike weren't John or Charles. They were for the lioness, for the queen, for Bohemia. But Elisabeth never took the field. She remained behind, hidden, writing, waiting, the spiritual center of a storm she had helped create. Her body could not ride anymore. Her lungs ached. Her fingers trembled. But her mind, her will, was sharper than ever. And then something unexpected happened. Her son, Charles, now a teenager under his father's control, began to ask questions. He read accounts of the uprising. He heard peasants sing his mother's name. He read old letters she had written to him in his youth, stories of Wenceslas, of ancient Czech kings, of the lion that never bowed. He began to see his father not as a ruler, but as a foreigner. And so, in a moment that would mark the beginning of Charles's transformation, he sent a secret message to his mother's allies. A note, a single line. I remember. That message, intercepted years later by imperial archivists, is one of the only surviving pieces of correspondence between Elisabeth and Charles during the war. It changed everything. The nobles, emboldened, saw a future not just in Elisabeth, but in her bloodline. Charles became the symbol of unity, his mother's heritage, his father's legitimacy. A Bohemian king for a Bohemian people. John knew he was losing the narrative. And so, in 1325, he struck a final blow. He declared Elisabeth's remaining supporters traitors. Dozens were executed, castles razed, her family estates confiscated, her name stricken from royal records. The civil war, short, brutal, devastating, was over. Elisabeth lost. Again. But not entirely. Because the cost of John's victory was greater than he realized. His authority, though intact, was hollow. His people no longer loved him. His court, though rich, was fragile. And his son, his heir, was slipping through his fingers. As for Elisabeth, she never returned to court, never saw Prague again. She faded quietly, not in shame, but in certainty, because she had fought a war not for herself, but for the soul of a kingdom. And though the banners fell, and the castles burned, and the names of her allies were erased, one name remained. Charles. The boy who remembered. The war was over. The castles had gone quiet. The rebel banners had been torn down. And the royal scribes had returned to their parchment, writing again of treaties and taxes. As if nothing had ever burned. But something had changed. Not in the laws. Not in the court. In the soul of the kingdom. The people remembered the smoke. The names whispered in back alleys. The queen who had once stood tall, then disappeared. The boy she had left behind. And while John of Luxembourg paraded in triumph through the halls of power, consolidating his reign, there was one place his victory never reached. The little manor in southern Bohemia where Elisabeth lived out her final days. She did not live as a queen. There was no gold, no throne, no court musicians. Only the soft rustle of pages in a prayer book, the creak of wooden beams, and the hush of footsteps from her few remaining attendants. She had aged beyond her years. At just over 35, her body was failing. The lungs that once carried battle speeches now barely whispered. Her face, once regal and resolute, had grown thin, pale, ashen. But her eyes never lost their fire. She spent her days in the garden when weather allowed, wrapped in furs, seated beneath the linden trees. There, she would listen to poems read aloud by her handmaidens. Bohemian verses, tales of old kings, fables from the countryside, where her name still stirred reverence. Night, she prayed, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for memory. She knew what they were trying to do in Prague, in Rome, in the empire. Her name had been stricken from records. Her titles revoked. Her crest removed from city walls. But history, she believed, was not written by scribes. It was kept alive in the minds of children, in the songs of bards, in the hearts of the people who passed stories from fire to fire. And so she waited not for redemption, but for something deeper. For her son to understand. Charles, now 15, was still far from home. Raised in France, trained by imperial tutors, praised for his intellect, admired for his poise. He had become everything his father wanted. Multilingual, educated, cosmopolitan. But every now and then when he wrote his name, he paused. Every now and then when he heard Czech spoken in secret among travelers, he listened. Because there were things in him that no imperial training could erase. Elisabeth had planted them too deeply. And though she would never see him again, never hear him speak her name in public, she knew. Mothers know. In her final weeks, she requested no visitors. She asked for her hair to be washed with water from the Vltava, the river of Prague. She requested a cloak embroidered with the pre-misled lion, worn, faded, but still hers. And one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air turned to silver frost, she closed her eyes for the last time. There were no bells, no armies, no morning decrees, just the whisper of wind through the linden trees. She was buried at Zbraslav Monastery, in a modest tomb beside her ancestors. The ceremony was quiet. The priest read from psalms. The nuns sang in Czech. And then the world moved on. John made no public statement. The court issued no eulogy. Her name was left out of the royal chronicles for that year. To the world of emperors and kings, she was a footnote. But in the villages of Bohemia, candles were lit. Peasants left flowers on the roads she once traveled. Noble women wore blue in mourning. At taverns, men toasted in silence. To the lioness, they said, to the mother of our king. And far away, in a quiet chamber in Paris, Charles received a letter. It was brief, formal, cold. Your mother is dead. Zbraslav, November 28th. He said nothing. He dismissed the messenger. He returned to his lessons. But that night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire until it burned out. Then he took out a wooden box, small, carved with vines, and opened it. Inside were the letters. The old ones. From when he was a child. From her. He read them again slowly. Stories of Bohemian kings. Of saints. Of lions carved in stone. Of rivers that never forget the hands that built their bridges. And somewhere in those pages he found his name. Not Charles. Not Karl. Not Carolus. Václav. The name she had given him. The name of his grandfather. Of kings. Of the land itself. In that moment, Charles stopped being a prince of Luxembourg. He began the long journey toward becoming a son of Bohemia. It would take years, wars, crowns, sacrifice, but he would return. And when he did, he would raise her banner again, not just out of love, but out of duty. Because Elisabeth had never needed monuments. She had raised one in flesh and blood. And now history would remember. Power has a strange way of multiplying. After a certain point, a king no longer needs his people to adore him. He only needs them to obey. And in the years after Elizabeth's death, John of Luxembourg became more powerful than ever, but more distant than he had ever been from the land he once promised to rule. Bohemia had crowned him, but now it hardly knew him. He was no longer the teenage boy awkwardly navigating Czech rituals or fumbling with foreign customs. By the 1330s, John had become a legend in motion, a monarch without a throne, a knight without borders. To the outside world, he was magnificent. He rode at the head of imperial armies, fought in Italy, negotiated with popes, dined with kings. He spoke Latin, French, and German with fluency. He wore the finest armor in Christendom, golden-laid, lion-crested, trimmed with crimson silk. He was called the Night King, the restless monarch, and eventually, John the Blind. He was everywhere. Everywhere but Bohemia. The land he had been crowned to rule had become little more than a footnote in his itinerary, a source of coin, troops, and noble titles to reward his allies. He delegated governance to appointed councils, many of them German or French. He levied taxes to fund campaigns that had nothing to do with the Czechs. He rarely spoke their language, and when he did, it was always through an interpreter. The people noticed. Farmers stopped cheering at royal visits. Nobles began addressing letters to his son instead. And the few times John did return to Prague, it felt less like a king coming home and more like an emperor visiting a foreign province. The Bohemians called him Král Cizinek, the foreign king. He didn't seem to care. His heart belonged elsewhere, to the glittering courts of France, to the endless wars of Italy, to the chessboard of diplomacy across the Holy Roman Empire. There, he was admired, respected, feared. In Bohemia, he was resented, tolerated, forgotten. The irony was cruel. John had married Elisabeth to gain a kingdom. He had fought to control it, struggled to shape it, even waged war against her to keep it. And now that she was gone, now that the title was undisputed, he no longer knew what to do with it. There was no one left to fight. No one left to impress. Only a son, growing stronger. Charles? Raised in France but carrying his mother's voice in his blood, Charles was everything John was not: quietly observant, rooted, strategic. He studied languages not for diplomacy but for understanding. He learned Czech again. He read Bohemian law. He memorized the histories his mother once whispered beside his cradle. And perhaps most dangerous of all, he listened to the people. He began to write home. First cautiously, then more frequently. He reached out to nobles, asked questions, requested records. And eventually he did what John had always feared. He asked to return. Not as a boy, not as a visitor, but as heir. John hesitated. He had wanted Charles to inherit his world, imperial, western, boundless. Not hers, not Bohemia. But he saw what others saw, that his time was waning. The wars had wearied him. His eyesight had begun to fail, slowly at first, then rapidly. A disease of the eyes whispered across the courts. Treatments failed. Darkness crept in. By the late 1330s, John was completely blind. And so, after years of resistance, he relented. He allowed Charles to return to Bohemia, nominally as vicar, a placeholder. But everyone understood the truth. The prince had come home. Charles arrived to a quiet welcome. No parades, no royal fanfare. Just a cold Prague morning, the smell of ash in the wind, and a few old nobles waiting at the gates. But when he walked the streets, the people stared. Some whispered. Some bowed. Some just watched. And then an old woman selling bread stepped forward. She touched the edge of his cloak and said, "You look like her." He didn't ask who she meant. He already knew. Back in Luxembourg, John waited. He would never see his son rule, never see Prague again. But he heard the stories of how Charles spoke Czech fluently, how he restored dismissed nobles, how he visited monasteries and listened to old poets, how he dined with the same craftsmen his mother once defended. And perhaps in the dark, John remembered her. Perhaps he finally understood what Elisabeth had fought for. Not power, not rebellion, but belonging. He had spent his life conquering nations, but she had conquered time. Because now, the people no longer looked to the imperial banners that John had flown. They looked to the lion crest she once wore. And for the first time in decades, Bohemia had not just a ruler, but a son. As for John, his final years were spent in darkness. Not alone, surrounded by retainers, doctors, chroniclers, but hollow. He had everything and nothing. He was the king of Bohemia, but Bohemia no longer called him king. When Charles returned to Bohemia, it was not with trumpets or legions. There were no golden carriages, no banners flapping from castle towers. Just a slim, sharp-eyed young man in a dark cloak, riding through the old streets of Prague like a shadow. No longer a boy, not yet a king. But the city remembered. They remembered the name he was born with, Václav. They remembered his mother's eyes. They remembered the stories, how he had whispered Czech prayers in foreign courts, how he had refused to forget. And so, as he stepped into his homeland after years in the empire, the people watched. And then they bowed. He was 23, fluent in 5 languages, educated in law, theology, and philosophy, trained by French clerics and imperial tutors. A prince forged in the fires of war and exile. But beneath all that, he carried something stronger. His mother's will. From the moment his feet touched Bohemian soil, Charles began rebuilding not just a kingdom but an identity. He visited monasteries and listened to monks chant in Czech. He met with local merchants and asked them what they needed. He sat in council with the old noble families, many of whom had once followed his mother into rebellion. And he didn't speak in Latin, or French, or German. He spoke their tongue. "I am your son," he told them, "and I have returned." And in that moment, the fracture that had split Bohemia for decades between East and West, between empire and nation, between father and mother, began to heal. But Charles was not only his mother's son. He had also studied his father's world. How empires work, how alliances are crafted, how faith is negotiated, how power bends but does not break. He knew that to restore Bohemia, he needed more than love. He needed strategy. And so, he began playing both games, the imperial and the national, and playing them better than anyone before him. He corresponded with the Pope in Avignon and secured papal backing. He reconciled Bohemian factions without spilling blood. He restored Czech as an official language of royal administration while writing imperial decrees in Latin. And in 1346, the moment came. The imperial electors, tired of John's absentee rule, wary of growing French influence, impressed by Charles's diplomacy, elected Charles as King of the Romans. The first step to becoming Holy Roman Emperor. John, now blind, did not protest. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he didn't want to. Either way, Charles became king alongside his father, 2 crowns on paper, but only one hand on the wheel. From there, he moved fast. He built a new university in Prague, the first in Central Europe, where students from across the continent could study in Czech. He began codifying Bohemian law. He funded artists and architects, constructing Charles Bridge, the new town of Prague, and what would become St. Vitus Cathedral, the very heart of Czech spirituality. He didn't just rule. He rooted. And yet, he never abandoned his wider ambitions. He met with kings across Europe, wrote theological treatises, advised on diplomatic disputes, and eventually, in 1355, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, the highest secular authority in Christendom. But unlike his predecessors, he did not rule from Rome or Aachen. He ruled from Prague. For the first time, the imperial scepter was held not by a German prince or Italian noble, but by a son of Bohemia. The people called him Otec Vlasti, father of the homeland. And in his court, amid the marble and incense and firelight, there was always a shadow, soft, constant, undeniable. His mother. He spoke of her often. To his scribes he recalled her pride. To his daughters, her faith. To his architects, her love of stone and sky. And when he signed documents, even imperial ones, he sometimes used the old name she had given him, Václav, because power had made him Charles. But memory had made him king. He did not rewrite the past. He fulfilled it. He was the bridge between 2 worlds, the crown of the empire and the lion of Bohemia. And no one before or after would ever balance them as perfectly as he did. The drums of war echoed across Europe again. It was 1346. The 100 Years' War had begun in earnest. France and England locked horns in a brutal struggle for power, land, and legacy. Kings rode out with banners. Armies crossed rivers and torched villages. And across the continent, nobles chose sides. In the middle of it all, a man too old to fight, too blind to see, tightened his armor one last time. His name was John of Luxembourg. He was 50 years old, completely blind, and still a king. He had once ruled Bohemia, a kingdom that now looked more to his son than to him. He had once been the golden prince of Europe, now a ghost in the eyes of history. But there was one thing he still possessed, untouched by politics or exile: honor. And so, when King Philip VI of France called for aid against the advancing English, John answered. Not because he had to, not because it was wise, but because a knight does not end his life in a bed. He gathered what remained of his personal retinue, loyal knights, standard-bearers, squires, and crossed into northern France. The French welcomed him not as an old man, but as a legend. Here was the blind king of Bohemia riding to war when others twice his strength had fled. His armor still shone. His voice still commanded. And though his eyes saw only darkness, he still remembered every step of the battlefield. On August 26, 1346, near the village of Crécy, the French and English met. The fields were soaked in late summer heat. Dust choked the air. The English, under Edward III, had fortified their position on a hill with archers and pikemen ready. The French, proud and burning with vengeance, charged again and fell. Wave after wave, night after night, cut down by English longbows. The field became a grave. John stood in the French command tent, listening, not to speeches, but to the wind, the hooves, the silence between volleys. And then a young messenger stumbled in. "Your Majesty," the boy whispered, "your son, Charles, has already retreated. The day is lost." John didn't flinch. "Is he safe?" "Yes, sire." He nodded. Then, slowly, carefully, he rose from his chair. He called for his armor, asked for his horse, summoned 2 of his knights, and then gave the order that would be remembered for centuries. "Tie my horse to yours, tighten the reins, and lead me into the fight so I may strike one blow for honor." They tried to dissuade him. He was blind. The French were breaking. The battle was lost. But he was not riding to win. He was riding to finish. And so they obeyed. 3 horses, 3 knights, bound together by ropes, and in the middle a blind king with a sword in his hand. They rode into the arrows, into the screaming, into the fading sun. Witnesses would later say they saw a formation push through the English lines, swords flashing. That one knight in foreign armor fought with uncanny precision, never hesitating, never turning. That he struck men from their saddles with the fury of someone who could see more clearly in darkness than others could in daylight. And then, silence. His body was found the next morning, still tied to the horses, still wearing his crest, the double-tailed lion of Bohemia. Edward III, the English king who had defeated him, wept. He ordered John's body treated with reverence, wrapped in linen, returned with full honors. Even an enemy knew this was not the death of a man. It was the end of a legend. When the news reached Prague, there were no rebellions, no grand ceremonies. But in the hearts of the people, even those who had long turned from him, something stirred. Because in the end, John had done what few kings dare. He had died on his terms. Not as a failed ruler, not as a forgotten name, but as a knight, sword raised, heart unbroken, riding into death as if it were just another charge. His body was returned to Bohemia, laid to rest at the Cistercian monastery of Klasters Braslav, and on his tombstone they carved no title, just a single line. He who could not see, still saw honor. And standing beside that tomb, in silence, was Charles. He did not weep. He did not speak. He simply placed his hand on the stone and whispered something no one else could hear. Some say it was a prayer. Others say it was forgiveness. But those who knew him best believed it was a promise. When Elisabeth of Bohemia died, the world barely noticed. No royal decree was issued. No history book paused. No court chronicler sang her name into the echo of official memory. But Charles remembered. And as the years passed and the crowns on his brow multiplied, King of Bohemia, King of the Romans, Holy Roman Emperor, so too did the echoes of her voice. Not loud, never loud, but constant. It was in the way he walked the stone halls of Prague Castle, not as a foreign ruler, but as a man coming home. It was in the way he sat in council, listening more than speaking, always asking, "What does Bohemia want?" It was in the words he chose, not Latin or French in official proclamations, but Czech, the language of his mother's lullabies, the language of the land she loved. It was in the city he built, Nové Mesto, the new town of Prague, designed not just for glory, but for people. Wide markets, churches for all classes, bridges linking past and future, and rising at the city's spiritual center, a cathedral she had once dreamed of seeing. Saint Vitus, her namesake saint, her silent patron. Charles did not place her statue at its gates. He didn't need to. The whole city became her monument. He founded Charles University in 1348, the first university in Central Europe, not in Rome, not in Vienna, not in Paris, but in Prague. And there he required that law be taught not only in Latin but also in Czech, to elevate the language, to dignify the people, to make her proud. Elisabeth had once been ridiculed for insisting her children learn the native tongue. Now the crown itself spoke her words. And when Charles began codifying the laws of the land, he went further still. He didn't overwrite the past. He organized it, preserved it, protected the customary rights of Bohemian towns, enshrined the rights of Czech nobles, and created legal frameworks that made Bohemia feel like a nation, not just a possession. Other emperors fought to expand. Charles built inward. They measured success in conquests, He measured it in libraries, cathedrals, stone, and ink. And through it all, he did not forget who gave him the soul to do it. He rarely spoke her name in public, but in his private diary, one entry appears again and again. I remember my mother in dreams. She tells me, be just, be patient, be Bohemian. He did more than remember. He fulfilled. In 1355, when he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, the supreme secular authority of Christendom, he could have moved his court to any capital in the empire. He chose Prague. There, he received envoys from France, merchants from Venice, scholars from Oxford and Krakow. All came to Bohemia, a land once dismissed as the backwater of Europe, now transformed into its spiritual and intellectual heart. And at the very center of it all, on his personal royal seal, next to the imperial eagle and the symbols of Rome, was the Lion of Bohemia. Her lion, the one Elisabeth had clung to in exile, the one she had embroidered on his baby cloak, the one she had insisted he never forget, even as his father tried to raise him in foreign courts. She had died with no title. Now her son bore all of them, and in each one, a piece of her lived on. Foreign emissaries noted Charles's calmness, his patience, his refusal to humiliate his enemies. But they never understood why. They never knew that in his mind, his greatest rival had been his father, and his greatest guide had always been his mother's absence. Because she had ruled him not with laws, but with memory. And memory lasts longer than crowns. In the end, Charles did what no king before him had managed. He made Bohemia matter, not as a prize, not as a frontier, but as a nation with a soul. And that soul, whether the world admitted it or not, was born from a woman history tried to forget. But he never let them. History has a way of forgetting women like Elisabeth of Bohemia. Women who do not reign with armies, who do not die in battle, who do not wear crowns when they fight, but fight anyway. History forgets mothers in exile, queens without palaces, rebels who bleed in silence. But Bohemia did not forget, and neither did her son. When Charles IV died in 1378, 50 years after his mother, Europe mourned an emperor, a scholar king, the architect of Central Europe's golden age. But Prague mourned something deeper. The last living echo of Elisabeth's voice. And yet, she was not gone. Not really. Because a true legacy is not measured in titles or even monuments. It is measured in the flame one leaves behind. And Elisabeth's flame still burns. It burns in the soaring spires of St. Vitus Cathedral, the very church she dreamed of as a girl, now the burial place of emperors, including her son. It burns in the classrooms of Charles University, where generations of students speak Czech proudly, where law and philosophy are taught not in submission to foreign courts, but in service of the people. It burns in the Bohemian lion, still waving on the flag of the modern Czech Republic, the same lion Elisabeth embroidered by hand during her exile. The same symbol she refused to surrender even when her husband took everything else. And it burns in every mother who has ever whispered into a child's ear, never forget where you come from. Elisabeth never ruled in name. She was never crowned empress. She never signed a royal decree. She died young, sick, and forgotten by her peers. But she raised a boy who would reshape a continent. She planted a vision that outlasted armies. She fought not for power, but for place, and for those who had none. In a world of iron, she was fire, the fire that refuses to go out, the fire that survives the winter, the fire that waits in silence, until the right heart carries it forward. That fire was Charles, and through him Bohemia rose, but behind him, always quiet, fierce, enduring, was Elisabeth, a queen without a throne, a voice without a chorus, a mother without a monument, until now, because now you know her story. And if you remember it, she will never be forgotten again.